So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Leigh.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to the museum, particularly the staff that I'm sure did the planning and handled all the logistics for all of us here. Kudos to them. And I'm sure you're glad that today's the day, and maybe you'll sleep tonight. My name is Leigh Kuwanwisiwma, and as was introduced, I've been the director for the Hopi Tribe's Cultural Preservation Office for 25 years, and this coming March will be 26 years. So it's been a pretty interesting journey for me personally, being the first and only director for the Hopi Tribe's cultural preservation efforts. What I'd like to do briefly here is to share my personal experience within the theme that's being presented today, which is repatriation. And we had lunch together, and I talked to both of my colleagues here about some of my personal perspectives in retrospect. And I like to share those with you, and I sometimes just call it the really untold stories or story about repatriation. In about 1990, I was notified initially by a small college in Southern California of them holding 2 infants from a Hopi ancestral site called Homolovi, which is about 70-some miles south of the Hopi reservation. And, of course, I had very little experience then, and for the first time I was really faced with a cultural, dilemma as to how to deal with a reburial, much less infants, because culturally we deal with infants differently than we do deal with adults, and I had absolutely no idea how to handle it. So, being that I was the assistant director for the tribal health department for 10 years prior, I had also established a cadre of older people. So I sought advice from them, and I think tribally throughout Indian country, that was the same dilemma of facing even my older generation advisors, because we didn't have a reburial ceremony. We just collectively didn't know how to deal with it. But they finally said, well, it's the most ethical thing we can do to place these 2 infants back into their final resting home. So they, at that time, established, or at least I was witness to, just an abbreviated ceremony for the 2 infants, and we reburied them. Since then, our effort from the Hopi Tribe has been particularly focused on human remains. We're slowly transitioning into the sacred objects and cultural patrimony objects, both with the statute under that guides the Smithsonian or this museum, and NAGPRA. We just recently completed repatriation and reburial over at Coconino National Forest. And facing me ultimately at the time, institutions began to share their inventory with us. It was pretty overwhelming as we looked at the collections out there that potentially would be affiliated with the Hopi tribe. The paper end of it was just that. It was daunting. But as we engaged in discussions under NAGPRA, and eventually began to actually do collections and repatriation of burial human remains, that became another cultural challenge to all of us and to me personally. And for the first time, of course, we were now going to handle remains. And I remember the first big collection we were going to deal with, and that was up in 2005 with Mesa Verde. And up at Mesa Verde, we were going to rebury about 1,500 individuals. And so the logistical end of it was a task that me and my staff worked out in terms of deciding on a common cemetery and the sequencing and the distribution of the remains based on cultural, based on the cultural practices. But I remember going into the trench and the boxes being delivered to us and opening up, me and some others opening up the boxes and now time to actually handle them. And I vividly remember that, all of us. And there was a couple of trucks full of the remains. And, initially, and even then, back in 2005, as I went into that burial and other burials before, reburials, I went in there learning about the history of collections, and then actually seeing the remains come out and having now placing them in their designated areas. I went in there with perhaps probably as many tribal people do, with mixed emotions, and particular one that I always think about even today is really anger. And particularly when you look at the types of remains that you're handling, you of course have the typical adults, female, male. But what was most distressing for me was infants. And because, like I said, we treat infants differently out on Hopi. And they're considered to be of the purest form of human life, untainted, both physically and emotionally. So we see the infants as cloud people. So when I began to handle those kinds of collections, that I dwelt on that. And of course, learning the history of collections, yes, anger. Also, mother and infants were really hard to deal with. And probably the most visibly affecting were mummies. And as we engaged, particularly with the Mesa Verde reburial, there was about a dozen of the mummies, and I didn't really have that really organized as to how to deal with it with the Hopi group that went up there. But when I mentioned to them, no one wanted to handle the mummies. So I handled the mummies, and I think visually they were the most affecting. And even though we end up with our cleansing ceremony, our smudging, everything else that we do today, we did, I think those kind of imagery at a personal level just simply lingers. And like over time, you kind of don't dwell on it, don't think about it, but like even now today when you bring it up, it's there again. So while repatriation is good in many ways, the case of human remains, the respectful reinterment back to earth, but also this kind of trauma that many tribes just simply don't talk about, and it's really unknown as to what really repatriation means or how it affects tribes. Same thing with the sacred objects repatriation. You know, in 1995, we visited Peabody Museum up at Harvard, and for the first time, the staff had us put on these protective clothing, full gear, our shoes were covered, gloves, everything. And that was the first time we ever were required to do that. So after that day, we sat around at our hotel room just wondering why they did have us do what they did with the clothing. So next day, we went in and we asked about it. And for the first time, they shared with us of the potential contamination of some of the Hopi objects with pesticides. So I didn't really understand that immediate information, but over time we know that many institutions, particularly museums, use pesticides to treat biodegradable items from insects. And as we went into the study of the application of pesticides, we also knew that by institution was pretty random. Few museums had any records on the application of pesticides, item by item. No one kept records of it. But it was important enough that the next day I asked to see the museum director, and I asked her about this potential problem, because I wanted to just sit down and talk about it. And it seems that immediately there was not any kind of real reaction in terms of urgency, so forth, from the director. And so I asked to see the museum attorney. So reluctantly, he met with me, and I said to him, you know, your museum has to cooperate with the Hopi Tribe. You know, I think we're facing a major problem here, and we need to know. If we're going to repatriate, we need to know. And again, it seems that he wasn't receiving me quite the way I expected. So I finally said, you know, it's a matter of legal liability. If you know, but more important, if you knowingly prevent any information from learning more about this problem, it's a matter of legal liability on your part, is what I told him. So that triggered off, of course, discussion, and later they did invest in laboratory testing of some of our items. And for the first time, I was beginning to understand the depth and breadth of this particular problem. You know, arsenic, the base chemical, one item was really high. And you know, on the 10th of repatriation is to have the cultures receive these cultural properties for reuse. And so with that first project, we knew that this was going to be a very significant agenda for the Hopi tribe. So in 1997, we applied for a NAGPRA grant, and we undertook a testing program of about 60 items that we had already returned back to the Hopi tribe. And you know, the results are online with the National Park Service. You know, one item that we got from the Field Museum, Chicago, tested 500 times the acceptable EPA level. It was so deadly. But you know, the sad part of it was that we had brought it home, we had given it to the clan people that were responsible for that. They had it in their home. They were handling the item, but we didn't know. And that item still is in isolation. You know, the laboratory, and one of them that worked with us is here, Dr. John McLennan. I don't know where he's at, but he and his team with the Arizona State Museum helped us with the Arizona Poison Control Center, and they told us, you know, it was our property, we would incinerate it. So Hopis, I hope you never ask to get this one back. It is so deadly. So by 1998, the chairman of the Hopi tribe issued a moratorium on repatriation. He said, we are not returning any more items unless they're tested and free of pesticides. And that's been our protocol since then. So I remember going into the villages with the first collection, 65, and letting the villagers and the Kachina priest, the village chief, and community people know that we're getting our Kachina friends back from certain museums. And there was a lot of joy. There was a lot of exuberance. And we did return them. It was a day for the villages. And then by 1996, I was going back telling them, I gotta retrieve them. I gotta take them back. And of course, I had to tell them that potential problem of pesticides. And you could see just the I don't know, they just didn't understand the problem. And so now the tribe is still holding a lot of that tested positive for particularly heavy metals and particularly arsenic. All of them are down at the repository in the National Park Service repository in Tucson, probably never to be returned or used by the Hopi people. So that's an untold story. In September, we worked with staff here at the museum, and we had filed a claim for some Kachina friends in 1998. But they also underwent some delays for certain reasons, but one of them was to make sure they were tested. September 27th was a huge day for some of the staff present here, Jackie Swift and Terry Snowball, Lauren, I don't know if she's here, and others. 95 of our Kachina friends were being returned home from the museum. And it was a big day for the Hopi people. I think 6 villages had items being returned. And I remember we had some of the Kachina friends out in our conference room there and asked the tribal employees to come over and pay homage to them with prayer, cornmeal, so forth. A lot of emotion. But within that collection, we also knew that there were 23 items from the museum that had tested positive for arsenic and heavy metals. Those will never again be distributed. Today they're still boxed up, but they're going to be housed over at the Museum of Northern Arizona, thanks to my good friend, Dr. Robert Brunick, who's been very helpful. Because we don't have a repository. We don't have any holding facilities out on Hopi. So, while it was good in a number of ways, of course, the whole issue of pesticides. And Hopi is at the forefront with this issue, and I keep asking the Park Service if they could at least consider a temporary moratorium on biodegradable items and work with the museums and the tribe so that all the tribes have an opportunity to get resources for their own testing program, because even as I speak today, items are being returned untested to many, many tribes over the United States. And I worry about it. So we're still aggressive in our work, making sure that everything that we're interested in repatriating is tested, and we have a cooperative relationship with every institution to achieve that. So really, repatriation has had positive results. We're now going into our sacred objects in terms of repatriation. But over time, with the human remains repatriation, the Hopi Tribe will have reburied 7,000 human remains over my 25 years. We would have reburied 15,000 funerary objects. And the Hopi Tribe is the agent for all of the pueblos when it comes to the administrative end. I work out all the paperwork, all the repatriation agreement, all the logistics. And I have a standing resolution by the Hopi Tribal Council that delegates me to do that. So using that, the pueblos have asked the Hopi Tribe to represent them. And we have a Laguna governor here, and we haven't, I don't think we've really directly had any human remains dealing with Laguna Pueblo that we've been involved with. But so we represent the pueblos for human remains. And as I look back, 7,000 is a huge number. It's probably the single largest repatriation of human remains to a tribe. So our ancestral people are now in the ground, and we've worked out protocols with multi-use agencies such as BLM, so that we can rebury on those jurisdictions as well. So it's been a pretty interesting task as far as repatriation from both sides, both from the institutional side and from the tribal side. And it's an experience that, of course, my staff is learning. I've got some young professionals that have worked with us. I help put 5 of our younger students into the anthropology, archaeology programs, and 3 of them have obtained their master's, and 1 of them will complete his master's this semester. So my staff is growing technically and culturally. So I guess when I ride into the sunset in another 25 years, we'll have some young cadre of young professionals that will take on this very important task. So I just thought something personal would do justice to this whole theme of repatriation today. So I thank you.
Thank you, Leigh. Leigh, before we move to Don's remarks, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One of them is about the notion that questions have come to you from others, museums and others, about why you make a point to take reburials to certain locations instead of just burying them on the reservation. And there has been a sort of an operating assumption on the part of others that place was not a very big important issue in that reburial process. Could you talk about that?
Well, as we learned about the proveniences of remains, particular remains, you know, the ancestral people had homes, and they were respectfully reinterred in those respective villages 1,000 years ago, maybe more. And it's very important that these remains go back to where they were originally taken out from, which is not really doable these days for a number of reasons, but at least in close proximity. So when we're dealing with, for example, BLM that prohibited the creation of new cemeteries on their land, they were asking us if we could just simply take the remains back to the Hopi Reservation. And we said, no, can't do that. Every year in November this year, the men go into the kiva and prepare certain types of prayer offerings. We do an all-night prayer vigils to petition the spiritual people to visit their respective remains. So one, it's very important that at least in proximity, these remains be reburied so that when we go through November, the spiritual people can find and connect with their remains again through the earth. That was important for the Hopi people. So we just can't bring these remains back to the Hopi reservation. So we've been able to work out with pretty much everyone these kind of cultural desires, and pretty much all of the agencies have helped us dealing with location.
Thank you. One of the things I learned from you at lunch was that when the inventories first began to arrive after the passage of NMAI's Act and NAGPRA, there were about 300 institutions that had material from your ancestors and your people. And you've worked so far with about 30 of that 300 to do the work you numerically listed for us earlier. But one of the things that, one of the large categories of work that remains, and this remains for many Indian nations, is to deal with those skulls that have been separated from the remains of the whole body. And you talked a little bit about the challenge that presents.
We did get, of course, our inventory from the Smithsonian too. And what was very interesting about the collection was that these were simply just Hopi skulls. And a fellow by the name of Fuchs was hired by the Smithsonian to come out to do just that, to collect nothing but Hopi skulls. And as I researched it more, I learned that the Hopi skulls were going to be part of this national interest in indigenous cranium studies. A very disturbing history that both the Smithsonian and the Walter Reed Hospital and the U.S. Army engaged in to study the intellect of Native people through these cranium studies. The Army was commissioned to decapitate Native peoples after, particularly in the Plains Wars, for that specific reason. And I have a huge file on that with the tribes that suffered as a result of this policy. Well, For Hopi, of course, we were never at war with the United States government, but they still needed specimens from the Hopi tribe. And that's what happened. They came in specifically for that and went into our ruins out on Hopi. The villages were protesting the disturbance, and Mr. Fuchs had the Indian agent locally get some military from Fort Defiance over in Navajo, from Navajo, to guard the excavations. And that's how they collected these skulls from Hopi, and they're still here. The dilemma is that, because we talked about it in the villages. So now we know where these skulls came from. The challenge is that you've got the remains still in the ground and the skulls somewhere else. The culture is asking, how do we deal with just a skull coming back? Because, of course, our desire is to reunite them with the remains, but we can't go in and re-excavate again. So how do we deal with just a skull? So we haven't asked for repatriation because it's still a standing question. I think they're looking at me to make a decision, but you know, it's difficult. And so, yeah, so that's part of my personal research. And I don't know if we'll ever return those skulls back.
Thank you, Leigh. Thank you very much.